user auth. So user auth is a concept, right? It's a set of things that we think about or care about. Let me close down some stuff from yesterday. We just got a fresh window here. Here's what we're going to play. And here's where we're going to get started. In Shirtsy, I've added a README, which is about auth. It's called auth README. And this is a pretty nice walkthrough of all the things that the labs go over and everything I'm going to be covering this morning and afternoon. So therefore, I'm not going to really dig too deep into the README. I think that one of the benefits to this learning style is I can show you some stuff, right? And then you can let this tell you some stuff. But our objectives are the same. Throughout the day, we're going to do some things to understand what auth is. It's two steps, right? It's authentication and it's authorization. We're going to talk about the difference between those two things and how they fit under the general topic of auth. So let me get the screen shared here so you can see the objective that I'm speaking of. And here we go. So yeah, our goals are let's get an understanding of how auth and auth differ, right? Where one is authentication and one is authorization. We're also going to talk about different encryption and hashing schemes and what bcrypt specifically is. We're going to talk about why we don't ever want to store user passwords. We're going to talk about how to use a Rails model using 3 keywords: bcrypt, password, digest, and has secure password. That's all the keywords you're really going to need to know. I'm also going to go slightly under the hood to show you what's going on under the surface so that it's not quite so mystical. We're going to build a user sign-up and sign-in flow in Rails today. We're also going to implement sign-up and login and logout, and then later on today, we're going to additionally authorize routes and views using some helper methods. So authorization must come at the end, right? So therefore, authentication is the first thing that we're talking about. Does anybody know, and you can type in the chat or unmute if you have a good thought on this, or even just a thought that you're having. You don't have to judge it, good or bad, whatever. What is the difference between authentication and authorization? That's very good, Jack. I think that's a really good way to sum it up. Authentication is a question of identity, and authorization is a question of access. Authentication asks the question, who are you? Are you who you say you are? How can we validate your identity? How can we validate the you that is you? And then authorization says, okay, cool. So I've seen your student ID. I've verified that you are a student, that you are on this campus. However, only faculty are allowed in this part of this building, right? So that's the authorization. I know that you are who you are, but at the same time, I now that I know you are who you are, I can make decisions for what you should do based on knowing who you are. So authentication needs to come first. We need to figure out who the who is, and then afterwards we get to decide where that particular who gets to go. So let's talk about how we can authenticate a user. Generally, we authenticate a user by using a password, right? We authenticate with a password because the way that a password is created is that generally a user has a form, and then they write in a bunch of characters into the form, and only the user knows what characters they typed in, right? If you typo, you're the one that has to delete, count back, oh yeah, 3 characters ago, that should have been a capital that, and then 2 more of those. Cool. So you don't know what I typed, right? That's only in my head. So the password only living in my head, if I'm secure as a user, if I don't share that password with somebody else, the next time that I say hey, I'm ready to enter the password associated with this email address with the account that I created, then if I haven't told anybody else the password, and I'm able to give you a password that matches what you stored, kind of by process of elimination, I have to be that person that set the password, because the way a password is supposed to work is that only the person who created it knows about it. Why do we care about storing passwords in secure ways as developers in general, right? Because we don't want people to get into a database and see a password that a user has stored and then be able to log into that password. What if we run a banking application? Now the user who's cracked our database can go and log into any account in the bank and steal a bunch of money from the bank. But obviously we're not bankers. we're not like bank code developers yet, right? We're making like small toy apps. Can somebody give me an idea of why it's still a good idea to practice password security, even if we're not making like financial level applications, if we're going to ask a user to give us a password? Very good. Thanks, David. Thanks also, Mike, in the chat there. Yeah, people use their same password over and over. We trust that a user is going to do all the right secure things with a password, right? That they're going to set a whole long password that has a whole bunch of characters on it. By the way, there's like a site, I think it's called howsecureismypassword.com, where they just have a front end form that will like calculate a number for how hard a password is to crack. So we're assuming that a user is not just going to write like what was that from the movie Hackers, that they wrote God as their password, and like that was one of the most common ones. So if I wrote God in here, that could be cracked in 400 nanoseconds. So like that's almost a microsecond. That's pretty small. So yeah, like people don't necessarily store a long enough password, but like even if they do store a long enough password and it's really secure, I'm just writing characters here, no numbers, no capitals, just letters. When a password gets long enough, it's really really hard for a computer to crack. Even if they're doing that though, if they're redoing it in other places, that's going to be a problem. Because what if I have some other security problem in my app and somebody does manage to crack and see this user's password that they've set on my app, and the user, bless their heart, is using the same password on my little toy app that they used to log into the bank? Oh no, now somebody's got that password, they can crack into the bank. So we care about authentication because we want to know who people are. And the second that we need to do that, we need to recognize that banks also want to know who people are, government agencies want to know how people are, other various programs that could potentially endanger somebody if their identity was like exposed through that stuff could want to know who those people are too, and so people reuse passwords. Therefore, we need to do something special. We need to do something called hashing to a password. Yesterday we talked about encryption, right? That's where like somebody had a jumble representing our session hash, and then like the server could take that jumble and decrypt it, right? Hashing is not decryptable, right? So why salted hash is as good for passwords as for breakfast. That's fantastic. So there's this notion of hashing, which is an algorithm that basically chops up a string. I'm going to actually send this so that people can see like a longer description later on. But you basically chop up a string and destroy it in such a way that you use like big prime numbers to do it, like a big mathematical fancy algorithm, where you can generally tell if something that started from the same value has the same identity as something that started from the same value, but you can only do that by comparing the hashes that they get chopped up into. You can never turn a hash back into the thing that was chopped up. And to make it even harder to crack, because there is this notion of an attacker still being able to get a lot of commonly used passwords and then getting a list of ways that those passwords get hashed up and chopped up. It's called a rainbow table, and then if you create a hash out of a rainbow table, then eventually you're going to see a password that matches up something that you've already stored, and you'll be able to reverse engineer a user's password. So for more randomness, we need to have a tool that doesn't just one-way break up a password so that even the remnants can't be compared to each other. We need to also salt the hash. So a random number gets added. They take stuff sometimes about like your system state. Sometimes random numbers are even generated by taking pictures of like lava lamps. I'll send that article out. That's really fun, lava lamps and random numbers. Somebody remind me about that later. But they apply some randomness on it, and then essentially you get a message that is a long chopped up string that looks nothing like the original string that was given, that I could store in a database, that I am unable to turn back into the password that was originally given to me. And because the salt is randomized, you could rehash the same exact like hello world password a million times and get a million different strings out of it. So it becomes very, very difficult for somebody to crack this. Not impossible, but just difficult. So the tool that we're going to use today implements a hashing and salting algorithm that's called bcrypt. Bcrypt is actually open source. You can look at it online and it still works. Once again, that has to do with like huge prime numbers and stuff that I don't really understand mathematically, but like basically there's operations you can do one way, but because of limitations of how we understand numbers relationships, it's really, really lengthy to do the other way. And that length of time is what people count on to dissuade a hacker. Basically, none of this stuff is invulnerable. Before we dive in, this isn't going to make your code perfectly safe. Everything is potentially crackable. But when we're trying to make our code secure on the web, it's kind of like outrunning a bear, where like hackers are the bear. We don't need to necessarily be the fastest runner among our human friends. We just need to be faster than some of the humans so that the bear gets some of those humans first before us. We're never going to be able to outrun the bear. The bear's faster than us. But hopefully it's going to stop and eat some of our less secure friends, and then we can carry on with bcrypt stuff. Yay, not grim at all. Fantastic. Let's move in and talk about some more specifics in here. So when we want to use bcrypt in a Rails application, we need to add bcrypt to the Rails application. Let's start in the gem file and dig into some code. I'm going to enable gem bcrypt. It's here always by default and just comment it out. So what I'm going to do now that I've added gem bcrypt is I'm going to rebundle, because I've got a new gem in the gem file and I want to make sure that it gets added. Cool, it's there. Can I see where it got used? Using. So many gems. It's hard for my head to see it. Oh, there it is. bcrypt 3.1.13. We're using it now. So now we have access to a special kind of object, and I'm going to spend some time in the Rails console playing with a special kind of object that bcrypt gives us, which, in order to initialize it, we give it a password string. And bcrypt takes that string, hashes it according to the bcrypt algorithm, applies the random number salts to like jumble up the hash even further, and creates what's called a bcrypt password object. That password object has a string representation of itself as a hash, but it also has behaviors that allow other plain password strings to be hashed through the same algorithm to see if two password objects match. So here's what a flow might look like. We could have something like created user password equals bcrypt password dot create, and then we'll do hello world as our password. So I'm creating a new user. They're asking, what's the password you want to set? And into the password field, I type hello world. Behind the scenes, this is what our controller is going to tell our model to do. Hey, bcrypt, why don't you generate a password from the plain text string hello world? And we do, and we get this. And somebody type into the chat, what data type is created user password right now? Looks like a string, right? We got quotes. Here's the tricky thing about bcrypt. The security actually starts here. Bcrypt is already obscuring the true nature of this object. This is actually a bcrypt password object. When it prints out on the screen, we see the string format of it, right? I could say string version equals created user password dot 2s. 2s is not destructive, so creative user password is still a password object, but string version is now a string, right? Here's the difference between being a password and being a string. I said the string was hello world when I created the password up here, about 10 lines up from the bottom. When I said the string was hello world, if I look at string version, it looks like this. Is that string going to be equal to hello world? I don't think so. Of course not, right? Because if I'm a string, right, this is kind of like calling a method on a string. We're calling string.double-equals and passing in hello world as an argument. Same code, different syntax, right? So if we're calling .double-equals on an instance of string, what we're saying is let's use the strings version of double equals to calculate equality. That means let's go character by character and make sure that every character lines up and no string is longer than the other string, and then we know that those strings are equal. By contrast, our password object as a bcrypt password instance, created user password, pardon me. Now that evaluates to true. And isn't that interesting? What if I give it the wrong password? Add a 1. Now it's false. This is because created user password, as an instance of bcrypt password, they've gone in and gone class Let's in the class definition, let's do a new definition for double equals that takes an argument. It's no longer going to do the default Ruby kind of double equals. It's not checking to see if two strings are equal. We're not checking to see if two Ruby object hashes, if you remember from mod 1, these kind of numbers that look like 0, stuff like that, right? We're not comparing the equality of those things at the start of an object in Ruby. We're taking the string, passing it through the hashing algorithm, salting it, checking out what comes out on the other side, and comparing it mathematically to what's happening on the left-hand side of the equal sign to determine, is the sausage that came out when we ground up this pig the same flavor as the sausage that came out when we ground up the original password and created a password object about it. Incredibly cool, incredibly powerful tool. So if we wanted to operationalize something like this, we'd have to think about what it is that we want to do for our user and what it is we want to do in our database. Because in reality, we're not going to be able to store a bcrypt password object in our database. We're going to need some way to store it as a format that the database understands. So what we'd probably do is save string version, right? We'd say like saved equals string version. Now I've got something that's saved in the database. It's an instance of string. I've pulled it out of the database because a user is trying to log in. They give me their user email that they did when they created this password in their account, right? They log in with their email. I get the user instance out of the database. I'm able to look at something that I've saved on that database row, my saved string version of the password. But my problem is that if I have a password attempt equals hello world, my good password, and I say saved is the same as attempt, that's not the case, because saved, if you remember, is just going to be that long string, and it's just a string instance. So here's the thing we can do. We can do reinflated. I say reinflated because I imagine the password object is taking up more dimensionality as just a simple string. So I'm going to say reinflated, and then I'm going to call a slightly different method from bcrypt password, because not only does bcrypt have a password generator in create, it also has a password reinflator in new. And what new will take in is going to be one of these hash strings, right? It's not going to take something like this. Invalid hash. Password.new does not work with plain text. That's what password.create is for. Password.new just takes an existing hash. So we'll take our saved string, pass it in, and bcrypt is smart enough to go, oh yeah, this string starts with $2A, $12. That's the calling card for our bcrypt hash. And so therefore, I know that I can turn this back into a full-fledged password object. So we're going to reinflate. We've got this thing. String still looks the same, but now if I look at reinflated, how about that? It's a password. Now we could do reinflated is the same as attempt. True. So what do we have? We have this password object that needs to live in the database as a string. We have two different worlds. The database needs to only hold that hashed out, broken up, digested version of the string, right? And it needs to be a string. And then in Ruby land, we need to have a way to turn that string into a password instance from bcrypt as needed so that we can authenticate password attempts, or when we're setting the password, pass a password attempt through this bcrypt filter in order to set something in the database the way that we'd like to, right? So the way that this might look in a user model is we would create virtual attributes through which bcrypt could manage our user and say, oh, well, maybe the user can use the namespace password, but under the hood, we're actually going to have a different named field so that we never actually touch the database ourselves. We only let bcrypt write to and read from the database, and then we have another method that talks to bcrypt, which is acting as an intermediary. So here's what I'd like to do. I'm going to generate a model for a user in my app real quick. Because I'm in Shirtsy. I was ready for users. I've got a user's controller. Actually, do I have my user model already? I think I might have one. Let's double check. Sales, users, yeah, sure do. Users and shirts. Let's go and check out what we've got going as far as our user model. Models, user, has many shirts. We had talked a little bit about a user's many-to-many or one-to-many stuff, so I'm going to take that out. We don't need that reference for right now. A user has many shirts, and here is where we could say something like def password And a password would be about taking something that's in the database at a field that I'm going to say is called password digest. I'm going to use this from now on. Password digest is the term that I use to refer to a migration field. If I'm looking at the schema and trying to see what the status of a user is here, a user does not have a password digest right now. It's got a name, it's got a quote, it's got an avatar. So let's actually generate a migration to represent where the password digest is really going to live in the database. So I'm going to say Rails G migration, add password digest and email to users. Yeah. Go back to our code. Oops, sorry, I got two editors open. My eye flashed over for a second. Cool. Add password digest and email to users. Change, and then let's find our command for adding a column. Add column Rails migration. If you've already built a user model, this is probably the kind of work that you're going to need to dig into today. Adding a column to an existing table. My web is being a little slow. I'm going to go to one of these links in a second. I think it's something like this. Add column. I think it's the table name. And then I think it's going to be password digest. And then this will be a string. Yeah, that's it. Table, field name, data type. Please don't use integers in your variable names or field names. Write out the word. That's a Rails style thing. Add column users password digest string. We could also add a column for email. Let's give this a shot. Perfect. Looks like we did two add columns. We can go back and look at our schema, see what our users table looks like. It does have a password digest, and it does have an email. So what we need is to have the password digest live in the database. It's very important to remember this next thing that I'm going to tell you. This is the whole point of our security. The whole idea is that we never store a plain text password in the database. We are never going to name a form field password digest. We're never going to accept a user param called password digest in our controller. Password digest is something that we're not going to touch directly through that name whatsoever. Instead, we're going to have something like this. Password, as a reader, will read the password digest from the database, but that's just going to be the string. So it's also going to reinflate it, so we've got it to work with as an object so we can authenticate with it. bcrypt password.new will reinflate an existing saved hash, right? But how did self.passworddigest get into the database? This is where I want to use a different namespace. This is where a virtual attribute is a lifesaver for me. If I just create the namespace password, now if I have a form field called password, whenever the password is getting set as a key value pair from a hash on a user object, what's actually going to run is this password equals method. So this is going to take a new password, and what it's going to do with the new password is say bcrypt password creating a brand new password from scratch. And once it creates that, it's done its job as bcrypt, and we can funnel that into self.passworddigest. So this is a virtual setter method called password equals. This is a virtual getter method called passwords. And then if we need to authenticate a user with a password attempt, we could write a method like this. Authenticate try. This is like our password try. I'm actually going to say pass try because try is one of those like reserved words in a lot of languages. Def authenticate pass try. We're going to say here pass try is the same as self.password. Why? Because self.password is going to come out of the database here as a string, but then get turned into a password object. Oh, wait, but I've got it backwards. Because here, if I say pass try double equals, I'm just calling double equals on a string, right? So I actually need to say self.password double equals. Therefore, I'm calling the method on the password object. That's how the special algorithm stuff works. And then I'll say self.password equals pass try. So now if we wanted to play with these methods that we wrote, here's the flow that's probably going to live in the database. I'm going to call user.first. This is Smitty, right? Remember Smitty? He made all those blue shirts, the one that said YOLO, famous Smitty. So cool. Smitty needs to have an email and a password digest. So I'm going to say Smitty equals the last thing we returned, the underscore, Smitty.assign attributes. And I'm going to pass in a hash. It's kind of like a hash that might come out of user params, right? And in this one, I'm going to include email, being Smitty at me.gov. And then we're going to say, now, once again, I'm never going to refer to password digest directly. That's just for the database and bcrypt to worry about. Once I've got that set, I can forget it here. I can say password and say YOLO world, Smitty's special version of my super secure password. So I'm going to set these attributes. Watch what happens when I hit enter here. Smitty now has this password digest thing that it's not even displaying to me right now. If I say Smitty.passworddigest, now it shows me this string that's been created. So because password was set to YOLO world, what happened when I assigned these attributes under the hood, Rails will make the object call a setter method with this name and a setter method with this name. So it had email equals because it inherited that from like the migration and model relationship, because email is actually an attribute in the database. Password is not, so it couldn't find a method from there. It had to go to this method that we wrote here. And that's where, that we wrote here because we're trying to set a password. So it passed in new password as YOLO world. YOLO world went into password create, and YOLO world is now hashed up in the password digest. That means if I say Smitty.password, I should get the reinflated object, right? Yep. And now I should be able to say Smitty.password is the same as YOLO world, which is the same as authenticating Smitty. Smitty.password dot authenticate with YOLO world. That returns true as well. A bad password is going to return false. Now I could have this, I could do something else. I could say like if self.password is the same as pass try, let's return self, right? Maybe the reward for authenticating is I give you my entire user object back. So you can just start working with that. And then else, or maybe I could just end this if, because that's a hard return. And then I could return nil at this point. I don't even have to be explicit though, because if I never run the if, then nil is what comes out. So that would be a way to do it too. But anyways, we've got these three methods, right? Here's the good news that I have to share with y'all today. You don't actually need to write these methods. You don't need to maintain these methods. All of these methods are wrapped up in has secure password, the third thing we needed to talk about today. So what is bcrypt? It's the gem that we install that gives us the mechanism to take a string and safely hash it into a password that we can save without ever being able to be compelled to turn that back into a password for somebody. Then we have password digest, which is the name of the field that bcrypt expects us to save in the database on our user model, or whatever has the password. And then finally, when we go into the user model itself, we add has secure password, which much like has many gives us a lot of methods around the namespace shirts. Has secure password gives us a password reader, a password writer, and a user instance authenticator method. So that's all what's going under the hood. This is how it's safe to kind of authenticate these passwords and how it's put together. Now that we have a user's controller, what I'd like to do is work on creating a new user that actually has a password. Right now we only have a user show, so I'm going to also create a new. That means I need a route for a new, and I know I'm going to need a route for a create. So I'm going to go into my config routes and make routes for those. It should be pretty straightforward because I've already been building this for a little bit. Config, where'd I put it? Routes, there it is. In routes, we're going to say resources users, and now I'm going to say accept some things. We'll do accept, edit, update, destroy, because I'm going to also create a user's index route just to show when we've created a user, the whole list of users kind of getting longer. So I'll do a def index. This will just be for all users. It's also a really good inroad to a form to have an index page for the thing that you want to build a form for. So a lot of times I start here. Users, we'll make an index. Interpolate. Users dot each to user. And then I think I'm going to do, probably links in a p tag. Sorry, I did make it new instead of index. Thank you. That was a mistype. Thinking about too many things in my brain at once. There we go. Thank you. So for each user, I'm going to do a p tag, and then within the p tag, I'm going to do a link to. User.name. Sure. Let's get a server up and check on this. Always serve from the left. Sure. Localhost 3000/users. Smitty, Lucy, Gordian, Doc. Now I rendered the H, and I can tell because I'm looking at that array at the end. Fantastic. So cool. So now I've got a list of users. I've got links to individual users. We had a show page set up. Let's just add a new link to this page. We'll probably do it right at the top. Make another link. Just copy this bad boy here. I know from just following these conventions for a while, it's going to be new user path, because that's how the conventional resource for users new is always drawn. New user path. It's going to be the second argument. And so we're going to go to create new. Yeah, that sounds good. Let me clean up some of my syntax here just to make it a little bit more readable. And I like it. Let's go back, refresh. We're sorry, but something went wrong. Oh no. Link to create new user path. Users each do user. Let me check my server logs and see what I did wrong. Internal server error. Oh dear. Everything's up to date. Syntax error. I don't have a comma. Thank you. Yep. That'll do it. There we go. So let's create new. Click on that. No template. Let's go make one. Users. Here's the time for new. When we go to new, we're going to want an instance of user, because that's going to help us to make sure that our form points in the right direction. It's also going to help us guide us into the conventional direction of having a form that we can later on edit and reuse for the editing. So I'm just going to say user is user.new, and then here I'm going to create a form for a user. And then I'm going to pass in the actual user instance. By the way, this is the same now as if I said form with model user. It's just an alias, right? So I'm actually going to use this just to show you that it's an alias. Do F. Same as saying form for. If I wanted to do a form tag, that's where I'd say form with URL, because that's really the difference between form for and form tag, right? The argument. So here, we'll pop in some f.label. We'll just keep one of these for fun. So we'll have f.label, name. That's going to be user bracket name, right? We'll have f.text field, name. We're also going to need to take in an email and a password. And minimum. And remember, I'm going to say password. I'm not going to say password digest, because that would cause me to take a plain text string and pass it right into the database instead of using bcrypt's password reader and writer. So we're going to do this, and I'm going to say here that this is a password field. Then we'll have an f.submit. always say some bit, and I feel very happy when I do that because I feel like I got a what in tarnation situation. I didn't render the form. I do that from time to time. Name, email, password, create user. Great. So I'm going to say Patton B, stalwart at patton.brave. Password, YOLO. Create user. We go to create user. We don't really have a route fleshed out for it though, right? So the backend's going to say something about how we didn't have a template. It just rendered nothing, right? We can check on our params this way. We have a user, name went through, email's gone through, password's gone through. It's, once again, nicely filtered. This used to not get filtered, and then that created security issues. If you ever got an email before saying, we figured out a security breach at our company where employees would have had access to looking at password information, what they were probably talking about was that their logs were not obscuring these passwords, and anybody with access to past logs could scan back and see the passwords as they went over the wire. So yeah, it's cleaner now. We can see that we've got nested params here for user. So in the controller, we can do the same thing that we've been doing with object creation and set up params for that. These are strong params, but I'm going to call the method user params because it matches up with the class name here. Params.require user, because we have nesting inside of that. And within that, we'll do name, password, oh yeah, and email. Order doesn't really matter here, right? So we've got these three. When we get into create, we can say at user equals user.new, user params. If the user saves, id user save, sorry. I haven't bought that new Doom game, but I've been thinking about it. If user.save, then let's redirect to the index. Otherwise, let's render new. And we've already got a value for @user in that case. I'm kind of wondering if there's a password validation that comes in with has secure password. First I'm wondering if a user is going to get created, but then I'm wondering if I don't fill in a password, if it's going to have a problem with that at all. And I'm not sure that it will, but let's see. We've got this create route. If it works, we're going to go back to the index and be able to start the cycle again. If not, we're going to render new. New's got the exact same instance variables there. So let's play with it. Let's see what happens. Let's refresh on users new. Let's say the name is going to be Marta. Email Marta at sample.com. .xcom, that's another good game. And then password YOLO. Now look at that, we've created a user named Marta. If we take a look here, Marta was saved with the password digest. So I did not need to literally have that reader and writer method open in my user. All I had to do was say has secure password. The password namespace was used to set our password digest there. So now we've got a user saved into the database. If I wanted to see, is it possible to save a user that doesn't have a password? We could try that out. Hit enter. I mean, nothing seemed to happen there, right? Started, user's new. Let's try this again. Create user. Rendered, started post users, parameters, rendered, everything's up to date. So it is blocking it from saving, right? If we wanted to take a look at why, we could in our controller right before re-rendering. I'm not going to get into actually rendering the messages because I'm going to talk about login next, and I want to make sure we have good time for that. But if we don't save, I want to do a printout of user.errors.full messages. Doing validations again is outside the scope of this, but you can imagine how you do it on the front end if you got this far and being able to view them. So let's go back to new. We go to create a user. We check on the back end to see what happened. Yep, password can't be blank. So has secure password is also a validation for the presence of a password. An empty string will not do. There's other instructions and documentation for how has secure password can be configured to set minimum password lengths and stuff. That's also kind of outside the scope because it's very easy to look up and as easy to configure as any other kind of validation or association that we've done so far. What I want to talk about is the login flow because now we've got a user. And how do we tie this in from yesterday, by the way? If we've created a user and the user is saved, can somebody tell me what I could do right here to tell Ruby and Rails, remember this person, punch their card, next time they come back, recognize them? What could I do here? Yeah, we could store the user in a cookie. We could store the entire user in a cookie, or we could store one piece of information. I think the ID is the right thing to store here. I'm going to say session user ID, because first of all, it's a short key name. Second of all, I'm just storing an integer, or at least a string representing an integer as a value. Pretty small, small piece of information to hang on to. That means that these cookies aren't going to be too bulky as they go back over the wire in the response. Cookies can get pretty big, by the way, if you're not careful. Session user ID equals @user.id. Now what I should be able to do here is, like at the index, I should be able to say something like @currentUser equals user.find by, I'll just do a find session user ID. So now that we've got a session user ID, we should be able to find one and call it current user. And then at the index here, we could do like a welcome message to the current user. Current user dot name. Because somebody created an account. Let's say users welcome current user dot name. Something along those lines. Let's see. Go back to our users page. Uh-oh. Couldn't find user without an ID. User.find session user ID. Well, you know what? Here's the thing that happened. I didn't actually complete that sign-in, right? When I went and created that user earlier, we just added this session user ID equals user ID. So I don't actually have a session user ID here at all, which means that user.find just fails. This is one reason I prefer find by, right? I could say user.find by, and then I can say ID equals session user ID. It fails a little differently. Still fails, but now it got all the way to the view. It had no problem setting current user, but current user didn't actually exist, so we didn't have a current user with a name. So what I might want to do here is instead go to the index and say, like, welcome. Is there a current user? If there is, I'd like to see the current user.name. Otherwise, I'd like to see nothing at all, if we could. So now we're going to have welcome with like an awkward space, right? Because we don't actually have a username to fill in. But this is what we call a little bit of authorization right here, because I've decided now conditionally to change my view based on whether I've detected that a user has done what it takes to be identified by my app, right? If I haven't authenticated a user, I'll display one thing. If I have authenticated a user, I'm going to display something else. These are the very, very basics of authorization, but let's go back and finish up a little bit of authentication work first. We're here. I don't have a user. Let's go ahead and create one so I can sign in one more time. I'm going to make pattern again. Do this one here. YOLO is the password. Create the user. Now that we're signed in, we did set a session user ID in create. By setting the session user ID in create, we're able to, after redirecting, still access that information, kind of like we did with the quiz game yesterday, and then find a user based on that, and start doing things in the application based on which user is currently signed in. So now let's log this user out, and then let's log a user back in. That means we're going to have to use the authenticate, but also we need to think about REST real quick. When I log out, what's going to be deleted? Feel free to type something up or chat something out. The cookie, right. The very thing that I just created to make sure that I'm logged in, quote unquote. To log out, I'm just going to have to get rid of that, which means that I need a specific kind of route now, right? We have a cookie. We're not creating a user. We're not deleting a user at all. We could say here resources, sessions, only, let's do this. Let's do only new, create. That's going to be our login flow. And then destroy will be our log out, right? And then we could make a controller about it called the sessions controller, because resources sessions is going to look for one of those automatically. So I'll make a new folder, sessions controller, not a new folder, a new file rather. We're going to have a controller that inherits from application controller. Let's borrow this line and change a few characters. And our sessions controller, if we wanted to have a destroy, this would just be something like session user ID equals nil, right? That would technically log us out. So now how could I hit a route like this? Let me do a Rails routes real quick just to check what I've just built. Boop, 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 boop. We have all the extra helper routes, right? But we did get this. We have sessions create, which is a get sessions new. And then new session is get sessions new. And then we have sessions create, which is post sessions. And then we have delete session, which is destroy. So if we say here session path, which I'm not sure about session path though, because I don't know if I really need sessions ID in here. These both make sense, but having a session with an ID in it, I don't know about that. Let's try this instead. Let's make a manual route that will be sessions destroy. I'll say delete /logout to sessions destroy. I'll make it a double quote string like the others. Let's check our routes now. Sessions destroy. Yeah, it's called logout now. Delete logout takes me to sessions destroy. So now I actually have a prefix. I can say logout path if I'd like to, and I would. On the index, I'm going to create a logout path. Views. Where did I put it? There it is. Do a logout. I'm going to say link to logout. Going to the logout path, but the verb matters too. So if I just stopped here, I'm going to be in trouble because I don't actually have get logout. This is where I have to set a method. Make it a delete so that it matches up with the route itself. We click on logout. Now what happened? Nothing seems to have happened. If we check our server logs, we did start delete, we just didn't have a template. So we did actually clear our session. We should probably redirect somewhere after doing the session deletion though. Should redirect to maybe the user's path again. Oops, user's path is a method. Cool. Now if we refresh, we click on logout, it deletes any session info. We don't have a user there because we did successfully log out and clear that. Let's create a login link now for our index to close things off. So here, link to login. Now, since I didn't custom name this route, but I actually just created a route by using resources, I don't get to say login path, right? I can say new session path, or I can say session path or sessions path to get to the create URL, but I don't have something called login unless I say something like get/login to, and then the controller and the method that I want to run. So this could also be an alias. There's no reason I can't have two URLs that go to the same place. This would be the hyper RESTful way to name it, and this would be the more user-friendly way to kind of name these routes to make it easier for people to understand what they're doing when they're in your app. So I think that now I should actually have a route called login path. And then it's going to just be a matter of putting a form together to take in a given email and take in a given password attempt from a user. So in that case, we're not going to be using our attempts to create a new object, right? We're going to be, sessions new session, login, there it is, login, get login. So we've got that there. We'll go back to our index. Login, we'll go to the login path. We don't need a method delete because that's going to be a get request. That's going to end up firing off our sessions new action. And this is going to render something called sessions new, right? So we need to have a folder inside of views called sessions. And I'll make a new.html.erb in here. And here, I'm just going to say login real quick. Login. And then we'll have a quick form. In this case, though, I'm going to do a different kind of form with. Why? Because I'm not creating an object right now. I'm just going to say a form with URL. The URL here is going to be /sessions. because that's our session's path, and the automatic method is going to be post, and so that should be okay. I don't think I really need to do like to pass an F into here, because I don't need to set like a context. I can just say do end, and then I can create fields. We could do a text field tag, because form with URL is just like using a form tag. Text field tag, and we'll call this email. And then we'll have another password field tag called password. Then we'll do a submit tag. And the submit tag will say login. Let's take a look at what that looks like for us. If we go back to our index here, we have a login link. It takes us to a new form. We forgot labels. Of course, my bad. I'm just going to write them in manually here in the interest of time. Let's say email and password. Cool. So now I have a login form. If I check and see where this form is trying to go, which I can do by inspecting, right? I can go up to the form. It's going to /sessions post. And if I look at my route, I can see that we do have a sessions post that's going to go to sessions create. So what I'm going to end up with is some form fields. And here I've actually just got them called email and password, right? There's no nesting here. The name is just email. The name is just password. I'm not going to actually do strong params in this controller because my work is going to be twofold. I'm going to have to first check for a user with the email. Secondly, check for the presence of a matching password. So if I have this password, which was stalwart@patton.brave with the password YOLO, I click login. Nothing seems to have happened. Let's go check. Sessions controller. Check our backend. We ran into some error here. The action create could not be found. It probably just took a while for my browser to error out. In any case, let's make the action create. Def create. Here's how it's going to end up needing to look. We're going to have to say, let's check on param's email first. So I'm going to say user equals user.findBy. Email is param's email. They're going to give me something over the wire named email. I'm going to be able to use that to look for a matching user, right? If we have a user and we have a user that we can authenticate. I can't just say if user.authenticate, because if I do that, what if it comes back as nil? What if somebody mistypes an email? Then I wouldn't have a user at all, so I can't call .authenticate on nil. So I need to do two checks here. If we have a user and we're able to authenticate the user by providing what the user gave us as their password attempt, then I think that what we'd want to do is set a session. Session user ID equals this user's ID. And I think at that point we'd probably redirect to wherever we were redirecting people when they logged in before. I guess we could just redirect to the user, like to their show page. Why not? To like reward them for logging in. Otherwise, we're going to want to re-render new. And in this case, we actually don't want to pass any information over, right? I guess we could add one thing. We could say @error equals invalid credentials. I could be slick. I could tell somebody if they weren't in the database, or I could tell somebody if they were in the database but their password attempt was wrong, right? But I don't want to tell them that much because we want to have some security through obscurity here. We don't want to necessarily have a user who is not looking for their own information, but instead somebody that they might be like stalking. We don't want that user to be able to enter somebody's email in some third-party site and have the third-party site tell them like, oh yeah, this like local only yoga studio does have this email signed up in our database. That'd be weird. Cool, so let's go here. I'm just going to render error if we've got one. Otherwise, it's just going to render nil right here. Let's test this flow out. I want to do a bad authentication, right? We've already played with this in the console, so I kind of know that it's going to work in terms of like the raw data. So I'm just going to click on login again. And that worked. That was my correct password attempt. So let me maybe go back to the index here. Log out. I'm logged out. Let's go back and log in again with bad info. Stalwart at patent.brave. I'm just going to hit a jumble of characters. I click log in. Ooh, interesting. I'm not actually seeing something change on the screen right now, which I'm kind of sad about. It didn't re-render. Rendering sessions, rendered sessions new, authenticity token, password attempt was bad. Did I maybe mistype? At error, sessions controller, at error. Very curious. Let's see if it can actually detect that I hit the error there. I've run into this issue before on my machine, and it's because my gems sometimes don't work with certain form setups. They don't re-render the page when it hits the option to re-render. I'd have to redirect maybe through this login instead. Let's do that. Let's do a redirect. Error, instead of saying error is invalid credentials, I'm going to say flash error equals invalid credentials, and I'm just going to redirect to new. Which is kind of cool, in my opinion, because it's going to take us back through another loop. It's going to start the user right where they begin, and it's not going to carry any baggage of rendering from a post route, which might itself be a security thing. I'm going to say flash error. Cool. Let's try that out. Let's go back to login, enter in an email that's not in the database, a password that doesn't exist. We go to login. Very curious. I'm not actually seeing which step I'm missing here. Maybe I'm not re-rendering the correct flash error, form with URL session, submit tag login. Apologies about the bad error handling here. In terms of the good login, right? The key thing is that on the back end, I'm able to do this authenticate step so that I actually can type in YOLO, which is the right password for this user, and it hits our if case, right? It hits our happy path in the sessions controller because the user that we found from that one form field was able to be authenticated using the other form fields, which lets us set a session and then redirect here. I'm not exactly sure why flash error is not... Oh, that's probably it. Thank you. New path. Thank you, Alice. I didn't change that side of the syntax. I said render symbol new. I think now the redirect will actually fire. Let's go back and try that again. While I'm at it here, just as and you should do this for yourself as well, when you have a page and you realize you have to type in a URL, just fix that. Yeah, it could be new. It could be new session path. It could be, oh yeah, login path. I think is what we want. If we say new path, that's going to be no route matches, right? So this always has to play off of our routes. So here we have something called login. Forget login. That's what we'd want to say. Redirect to the login path. Thank you. We'll go here, back to users 14. Gives us a link to the index. Now we've got a nice flow. Log out. Go to log back in. Try to log in with Yodo instead of YOLO. That redirects. There we go. Now we've got an error popping up, and we're going to keep having that error pop up until somebody gives us the right stuff. YOLO, login, and that goes and sets the session. So this is really the whole authentication flow, that instead of creating users, we're creating sessions when we do logins and logouts. Logging out is about destroying the session user ID. Logging in is about figuring out whether you can create it or not. To figure out if you can, first you have to make sure that there's a user that's present in the database with the given piece of identifying information, and then test that user using bcrypt's built-in authenticate method with params password. That method gets built in by saying has secure password, which gives us the ability to call methods like password, password equals, and authenticate. Those methods are bcrypt's interface into something that we're storing in our database schema called password digest. Password digest is a string. It holds on to the stringified version of the bcrypt hash so it can persist in the database, and that's what lets us check whether this user is who they say they are without us knowing so much to mess up that user's bank week if somebody happens to crack our database. Do we have any questions about any of this stuff? This is part one. We're going to get into part two this afternoon as we talk more about hey, what do we do more with conditional display here? Could we keep somebody from getting to a route at all if they're not supposed to look at it? How do we decide which things to show to which people? And things like that will be covered in the afternoon. For now, do we have questions on bcrypt, user creation, the login flow, naming conventions, why we named it sessions controller, anything like that? Well, alrighty. If there's no questions for now, this will hopefully be enough to kind of get you jump started on working with some of your user authentication. The key three things to remember here, going back to our auth readme, which once again, when I upload this code in a little bit, you'll have access to all of these steps like written out very, very specifically. We just didn't go through this readme because it's in my muscles. I don't need the readme right now, but y'all probably will to keep practicing it, so it's a very good resource. So yeah, this is what we went over. Please check it in the code and use it in your code. I'd probably say sooner rather than later. If like after working on your next thing, you have space to work on user authentication, doing it today while it's fresh tends to be the most successful pattern for groups. That's all I've got for now, y'all. I'll catch y'all later on. Bang, bang.